What if the teachers came first? Not prophets, not gods, not legends whispered around dying fires, but actual people, flesh and bone and knowledge, walking among our ancestors when the ice finally released its grip on the world, teaching, building, planting seeds, both literal and metaphorical, in soil that had been frozen for 100,000 years. What if everything we call the beginning was actually the middle of something else? Before we go deeper into this, if you're the kind of person who finds themselves drawn to history that doesn't quite fit, to questions that linger in the spaces between archaeological layers, go ahead and subscribe. Not because I ask everyone to, but because you're already here, already listening, already wondering. And if this resonates, if you feel that pull toward the mysteries that sleep between myth and evidence, leave a like. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Because this journey, this remembering, it's something we're doing together. The Pleistocene epoch ended approximately 11,700 years ago. That date matters. Write it down. Hold it in your mind. Because everything we're taught about civilization, about humanity's great leap forward, pivots on what happened immediately after that ice retreated. The Orthodox timeline tells us that agriculture began around 10,000 BCE in the Fertile Crescent. That the first cities rose in Mesopotamia around 4000 BC. That writing emerged shortly after. That before all this, we were scattered bands of hunter-gatherers, living hand-to-mouth, season to season, with no time for art, no energy for monuments, no capacity for the kind of organized thinking that builds temples or tracks the stars. It's a tidy narrative. Linear. Progressive. Comfortable. And yet, there are places on this planet where something doesn't align with that story. Places where the stones whisper a different timeline. Where the soil contains evidence of agriculture that shouldn't exist yet. Where architectural sophistication appears fully formed, without the expected centuries of experimentation and failure that should precede mastery. Consider Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey. Discovered in 1963, but not excavated until 1995. When archaeologists finally began to dig, they uncovered something that violated every assumption about Neolithic humans. Massive stone pillars, some weighing up to 20 tons, carved with intricate reliefs of animals, foxes, lions, scorpions, vultures. Arranged in circular patterns, precisely aligned. Built with tools that supposedly didn't exist yet. The site dates to approximately 9600 BCE. Let that settle in your mind. 9600 BCE. That's 11,600 years ago. That's 6,000 years before Stonehenge. 4,000 years before the Egyptian pyramids. This is humanity's oldest known megalithic site, and it wasn't a simple structure. It was sophisticated, intentional. The work of people who understood geometry, who could organize labor, who had a cosmology complex enough to warrant such monuments. And here's what troubles the Orthodox timeline. There's no precedent for Göbekli Tepe. No simpler versions discovered nearby. No archaeological evidence of people slowly figuring out how to move massive stones, how to carve them, how to arrange them in astronomically significant patterns. It appears fully formed. As if the knowledge was already there. But that's just one site. Perhaps an anomaly. Perhaps we simply haven't found the earlier, simpler versions yet. Perhaps our dating methods are slightly off, and it's not quite as old as we think. Except there are others. In 1987, a Japanese dive team led by Kihachiro Aratake discovered a massive stone structure off the coast of Yonaguni Island in Japan. Underwater. Submerged beneath approximately 25 meters of ocean. The Yonaguni Monument, as it came to be known, features what appear to be terraces, right angles, carved faces, and a structure some have called a ziggurat-like pyramid. Geologist Robert Schoch examined the site and noted features that suggest both natural formation and human modification. The controversy continues. But here's what we know for certain. If this structure was carved by humans, it would have been done when the area was above sea level. Based on sea level rise following the last glacial period, that would place any human activity at the site before approximately 10,000 BC. Before agriculture. Before cities. Before civilization as we define it. And the questions multiply. In Peru, on the high plateau of Puno, sits Pumapunku, part of a larger complex near Tiwanaku. The precision of the stonework there defies casual explanation. Andesite blocks, one of the hardest stones on Earth, cut with perfect right angles, interlocking surfaces machined to tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. Some blocks feature H-shaped grooves that suggest modular construction, as if the builders were working from standardized plans, creating interchangeable components. The conventional date for Pumapunku is around 536 CE, but that date measures the site's final phase. Recent excavations and analysis of organic materials trapped in the masonry suggest construction may have begun much earlier. Some researchers, analyzing tool marks and weathering patterns, suggest portions of the site could be vastly older than the final phase, potentially dating back to when the region experienced different climate conditions, wetter, more temperate, before the Younger Dryas period ended around 9700 BC. The Younger Dryas. That name appears again and again when we examine these anomalies. It's a geological period, a sudden return to glacial conditions that interrupted the warming trend following the last glacial maximum. It began abruptly around 10,900 BCE and ended just as suddenly around 9,700 BCE. 1,200 years of renewed cold. Of ice sheets advancing again. Of megafauna dying in massive numbers. Of human populations retreating, consolidating, struggling to survive. And when it ended, when the ice released its grip that final time, something changed in humanity. Not gradually. Not over the expected millennia of slow cultural evolution. Suddenly. The archaeological record shows an explosion of cultural complexity immediately following the Younger Dryas. Agriculture appears in multiple locations around the globe within a suspiciously narrow time window. Megalithic construction begins. Art becomes more sophisticated. Settlements grow larger. The standard explanation is that the end of the glacial period created favorable conditions for human development. That climate stability allowed experimentation with plant cultivation. That surplus food enabled specialization, which led to technological advancement. But that explanation assumes independent, parallel development across continents that had no contact with each other. It assumes that people in the Fertile Crescent and people in Mesoamerica and people in South America and people in Southeast Asia all independently, spontaneously decided to transition from mobile hunter-gatherer societies to sedentary agricultural ones within the same narrow historical window. It assumes coincidence on a planetary scale. Or something else happened. Something that left fingerprints in mythology. Every major culture on Earth has flood myths. The story varies in details, but the core narrative remains remarkably consistent. A great deluge, sent by gods or nature, destroys the world. Only a select few survive, often warned in advance by a benevolent deity or supernatural figure. After the flood recedes, these survivors carry forward knowledge from the previous world, teaching the scattered remnants of humanity how to rebuild. The Epic of Gilgamesh, from ancient Mesopotamia, tells of Utnapishtim, warned by the god Ea to build an ark before a catastrophic flood. The biblical story of Noah and the ark parallels this closely. In Hindu tradition, Manu is warned by a fish avatar of Vishnu about the coming deluge and builds a boat to save himself and the seeds of civilization. The ancient Greeks preserved the story of Deucalion, who, like Noah, was warned to build an ark to survive Zeus's flood sent to destroy corrupt humanity. But it's not just the old world. In the Americas, the Hopi people speak of multiple world ages, each ending in catastrophe, with survivors emerging to repopulate the earth. The Aztec tradition includes 4 previous world ages, each destroyed by different cosmic forces, with the 5th age, our age, created after the most recent destruction. The Inca preserved stories of a great flood that destroyed an earlier humanity, with survivors emerging from caves in the mountains to restart civilization. Indigenous Australian traditions, among the oldest continuous oral cultures on Earth, contain detailed descriptions of rising seas flooding coastal areas, forcing people inland, stories that align remarkably well with sea level rise following the last glacial period, suggesting these oral histories preserve actual memories spanning more than 10,000 years. 10,000 years of memory, passed voice to voice, generation to generation. Why would independent cultures across every inhabited continent develop such similar narratives? Why would the story of catastrophic flood and subsequent rebuilding appear in civilizations that had no contact with each other? The standard academic answer is that floods are common, that river societies experience seasonal flooding, that the stories are natural responses to local phenomena blown up to cosmic proportions in cultural memory. But that answer doesn't account for the specificity of the details. The warnings, the arcs, the preservation of knowledge, the survivors who teach. What if these aren't metaphors? What if they're memories? Collective, cultural memories of an actual event. A planetary catastrophe that occurred at the end of the Younger Dryas. Something that caused rapid sea level rise, massive flooding, climate disruption on a scale that would imprint itself in human consciousness for thousands of years. And more importantly, what if the stories about survivors carrying forward knowledge aren't mythological flourishes, but historical facts, preserved in the only format available to preliterate societies? Consider what the myths actually say about these survivor figures. They're not described as ordinary people. They're consistently portrayed as possessing knowledge beyond that of the people they encounter. They teach agriculture, astronomy, mathematics, architecture, writing law. They're described with terms that suggest otherness, gods, demigods, culture heroes, sky people, serpent people. In Mesopotamian tradition, the Apko, 7 sages who came from the sea, taught humanity the arts of civilization before the flood. After the deluge, they returned to help rebuild. They're depicted in Sumerian art as humanoid figures, sometimes with the heads of fish, wearing long robes, interpreted by most scholars as priestly garments. In ancient Egypt, the concept of Zep Tepi, the first time, refers to an epoch when gods walked the earth and established the fundamental principles of Egyptian civilization. The god Thoth, credited with inventing writing, mathematics, and astronomy, belongs to this pre-dynastic, mythological period. Yet Egyptian civilization appears in the historical record already sophisticated, with hieroglyphic writing, advanced mathematics, and architectural knowledge apparently inherited from somewhere. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, appears in the mythology of multiple cultures. The Maya knew him as Kukulkan, the Aztecs as Quetzalcoatl, the Kich, Maya as Cucumatz. The descriptions are remarkably consistent. A bearded figure, often light-skinned, who arrived from across the sea, taught agriculture, astronomy, and ethics, then departed with a promise to return. He's credited with teaching the calendar, with introducing maize cultivation, with establishing the principles of law and governance. The Inca tradition speaks of Viracocha, a creator deity who, after a great flood, emerged from Lake Titicaca and taught the survivors how to civilize themselves. He traveled throughout the land, instructing people in agriculture, engineering, and moral conduct, before walking across the ocean, promising to return one day. In India, the Sapta Rishi, 7 sages, appear in the Vedic texts as the founders of civilization following a catastrophic deluge. They're credited with preserving the Vedas, the sacred knowledge, through the destruction and teaching it to the survivors of the New Age. These are not vague, generic myth figures. They're specific, described in detail, credited with concrete knowledge transfer. And they appear immediately after flood events in nearly every major cultural tradition. If we strip away the supernatural elements, the tendency of oral tradition to elevate significant historical figures to divine status over millennia, what remains is a consistent pattern. Advanced knowledge appearing in scattered human populations following a global catastrophe. Knowledge that doesn't develop gradually, experimentally, over centuries, but arrives fully formed, taught by outsiders who then vanish from the historical record. Now consider the anomalies in what was taught. The Sumerian sexagesimal system, base 60 mathematics, is bizarrely sophisticated for a supposedly early civilization. We still use it today, 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. Why base 60? Because it's divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30, and 60, making complex calculations easier without decimal systems. It's an elegant, practical choice that suggests advanced mathematical thinking. But the Sumerians didn't show evidence of gradually developing this system. It appears in their earliest texts, already complete, already in use for astronomy, commerce, and timekeeping. The Antikythera mechanism, discovered in a Roman-era shipwreck off the coast of Greece, dates to approximately 100 BC. When researchers finally decoded its function, they discovered it was an analog computer, a device using bronze gears to calculate and display astronomical positions, eclipse predictions, and calendar cycles. The sophistication of its gear work wasn't matched again until medieval European clockwork, 1400 years later. How did ancient Greeks possess the knowledge to build such a device? Where did they learn the necessary gear-cutting techniques, the astronomical knowledge, the mathematical principles? The prevailing theory is that this knowledge developed in the Hellenistic world following Alexander the Great's conquests, blending Greek and Babylonian learning. But that simply pushes the question back. Where did the Babylonians get their astronomical knowledge? They inherited it from the Sumerians, who recorded detailed observations of Venus, Jupiter, and Saturn on clay tablets, observations that required centuries of continuous, precise record-keeping to accumulate. Yet the Sumerians, according to our timeline, are supposed to be at the beginning. They're supposed to be the first. If they're the first, why are they already looking backward? Why do their own texts refer to knowledge inherited from before the flood? Why do they describe their learning as restoration rather than innovation? The Sumerian king list, that strange cuneiform document we examined before, doesn't just record impossibly long reigns before the flood. It explicitly states that the kingship was lowered from heaven, and that after the flood, the kingship was lowered from heaven again. Lowered, not developed, not earned through cultural evolution. Given, bestowed, restored. The language matters. The Sumerians themselves, at the very dawn of written history, are telling us they're not the beginning, they're the continuation. But the continuation of what? Let's look at the archaeological evidence for advanced construction techniques that appear without precedent. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built during Egypt's 4th dynasty around 2560 BCE, demonstrates construction precision that challenges explanation. The base of the pyramid is level to within 2.1 centimeters across its 230-meter length. The sides align to true north, south, east, and west with an accuracy of better than 0.1 degrees. The internal passages and chambers are cut with right angles and smooth surfaces that modern masons admire. Some of the limestone casing stones, now mostly removed, were cut and fitted so precisely that a knife blade couldn't fit between them. This level of precision appears in the 4th dynasty with no evident developmental period. There are earlier pyramids, the Step Pyramid of Djoser, for instance, from about 2670 BC. But the leap in sophistication from Djoser's pyramid to Khufu's Great Pyramid is enormous. It's not a gradual refinement. It's as if someone suddenly understood the mathematics and engineering at a completely different level. And then, strangely, the quality declined. 5th and 6th dynasty pyramids are smaller, less precise, built with inferior techniques. As if the knowledge that created the Great Pyramid was partially lost, not yet developed. In Peru, the stonework at Sacsayhuaman, overlooking Cusco, displays similar anomalies. Massive andesite blocks, some weighing more than 120 tons, fitted together with such precision that, again, a knife blade can't penetrate the joints. No mortar. Just stone against stone, with surfaces ground to conform to each other in 3 dimensions. Not just flat faces, but complex, interlocking shapes. The Inca built Sacsayhuaman, we're told. But when the Spanish conquistadors asked the Inca about these walls, the Inca themselves said they didn't build them. They said the structures were there before their empire, built by an earlier people, using knowledge that had been lost. On Easter Island, the Moai, those haunting stone figures staring inland from their coastal platforms, were carved and transported by the Rapa Nui people. We know this from their oral traditions and from the archaeological evidence of quarries and transportation routes. But when researchers asked the modern Rapa Nui how their ancestors moved stones weighing up to 80 tons across the island, the answer was consistent. they walked. Not literal walking, of course, but the certainty in the oral tradition that the ancestors possessed knowledge, now lost, that made the seemingly impossible routine. Thor Heyerdahl, the Norwegian explorer, documented in the 1950s that when he asked the Easter Islanders to demonstrate how the moai were carved and moved, they initially refused, saying the knowledge was lost. Only after persistent inquiry did a few elders attempt to recreate the techniques, partially successfully. The implication, within just a few centuries, crucial knowledge had faded from their cultural memory. Now imagine that process over 10,000 years. Knowledge eroding, generation by generation, until only fragments remain. Fragments that look like primitive superstition to modern eyes, but which might preserve echoes of practical techniques we've forgotten. The legend of the Vimana in ancient Sanskrit texts describes flying vehicles used by gods and heroes. Modern readers dismiss these as pure fantasy. But some researchers have noted that the descriptions include specific technical details, materials, propulsion methods, even instructions for pilots. The Vaimanika Shastra, a controversial text allegedly channeled from ancient sources in the early 20th century, provides elaborate technical specifications. Most scholars consider it a modern forgery, and the evidence strongly supports that conclusion. But the question lingers: why would ancient Indian texts contain any descriptions of aerial vehicles? Why would they use such specific terminology? If it's pure imagination, why the technical language? Perhaps because somewhere in the deep past, someone saw something. And the memory lingered, distorted over millennia, until it emerged as mythology. Consider the Nazca lines in Peru. Hundreds of geometric shapes and animal figures, some stretching hundreds of meters, etched into the desert surface between 500 BCE and 500 CE. Many of the figures are only recognizable from the air. Why would a pre-modern civilization create massive artworks designed to be viewed from a vantage point they supposedly couldn't reach? The standard answer: the lines were ceremonial pathways, meant to be walked, not viewed from above. They were related to water cult rituals, astronomical alignments, or shamanic practices. And much of that is likely true. But it doesn't fully explain the precision, the scale, or the clear evidence that the creators understood these designs would form coherent images when viewed from hundreds of meters in the air. It suggests, at minimum, a conceptual understanding of aerial perspective that seems anomalous for their technological period. Unless that understanding was inherited, remembered, taught by those who had seen the Earth from above. Now let's examine the problem of parallel development. The pyramid as an architectural form appears independently in Egypt, Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica, and Asia. These were civilizations with no contact with each other, yet they all converged on the same solution: massive stone structures with a square base and sloping sides meeting at an apex. Why pyramids? From an engineering standpoint, it's a stable structure. The wide base distributes weight effectively. But it's not the only stable structure. Domes, ziggurats with different configurations, massive rectangular platforms, all were used by various cultures. Yet the true pyramid, that specific geometric form, appears on multiple continents. Coincidence? Logical convergence on an optimal design? Or evidence of a common source? Consider the ubiquity of serpent imagery in unconnected ancient cultures. The feathered serpent of Mesoamerica, the Nagas of Hindu and Buddhist tradition, the dragon of Chinese mythology, the rainbow serpent of Aboriginal Australian belief, the snake gods of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. Serpents don't appear in all ecosystems. They're not universal. Yet serpent symbolism, specifically associated with wisdom, creation, water, and otherworldly knowledge, appears in nearly every ancient culture. Jung would call this an archetype, a symbol emerging from the collective unconscious. But what if it's simpler than that? What if widely separated cultures use serpent imagery because they're all remembering the same group, described consistently across different languages and contexts? The Dogon people of Mali possess astronomical knowledge that baffled anthropologists when it was first documented in the 1930s. They described Sirius as a binary star system, Sirius A and Sirius B. Precise information about the orbital period and the nature of Sirius B as a dense, white dwarf star. This knowledge was encoded in their mythology and ritual practices, passed down for generations. Sirius B wasn't discovered by Western astronomy until 1862, and its nature as a white dwarf wasn't confirmed until the 20th century, requiring telescopes and spectroscopy beyond anything available to a pre-industrial West African culture. When anthropologists asked the Dogon how they knew this, the Dogon said their ancestors were taught by the Namo, amphibious beings who came from the Sirius system long ago. Skeptics have suggested the Dogon learned this from European visitors in the early 20th century and retrofitted it into their mythology. It's a possibility, but the Dogon insist the knowledge is ancient, encoded in rituals that predate European contact. And the Dogon are not unique. Multiple cultures around the world describe contact with teachers from the sky or the sea, beings who brought knowledge and then departed. If we compile these myths, looking for common elements rather than differences, a pattern emerges. Advanced beings arrive, often after or before a catastrophe. They teach specific skills: agriculture, astronomy, mathematics, writing, law, architecture. They're described as physically different, taller, lighter-skinned, bearded, or with non-human features symbolically represented. They eventually leave, promising to return or fading from the historical record. The knowledge they imparted persists, but gradually degrades as generations pass. This pattern appears in Sumeria, Egypt, India, China, Mesoamerica, South America, Polynesia, and among various indigenous cultures worldwide. Mainstream archaeology attributes these similarities to universal human storytelling patterns, to the natural tendency to deify the founders of civilization, to explain the unexplainable through supernatural narratives. And certainly, that's part of the picture. Humans do mythologize. We do create gods to explain what we don't understand. But what if, underneath the mythologizing, there's a core of historical truth? What if there was a civilization, a real human civilization, that survived the cataclysms of the Younger Dryas? A civilization that possessed advanced knowledge because they had developed it over thousands of years before the ice came back. A civilization that, when the ice finally retreated and they emerged from their refugia, found the world populated by scattered, traumatized bands of survivors who had regressed to basic survival mode during the long cold. And what if this older civilization, seeing an opportunity or feeling an obligation, chose to teach, to share their knowledge with these scattered remnants of humanity, to help them rebuild, to prevent the total loss of everything that had been learned before the ice returned? That would explain the myths. The consistent pattern of teachers arriving with knowledge. The descriptions of them as others, because they would have been other, culturally and perhaps physically distinct from the populations they encountered, populations who had spent 1,200 years in survival mode while this older civilization maintained continuity somewhere else. It would explain the sudden appearance of sophisticated knowledge in multiple locations. Not independent invention, but knowledge transfer from a common source. It would explain the pyramid forms, the serpent symbolism, the flood myths, the astronomical knowledge, the mathematical sophistication that appears too early and too complete. But if such a civilization existed, where was it? Where could a sophisticated culture develop before the Younger Dryas, maintain continuity through that climatic catastrophe, and then have contact with scattered populations across the globe in the early Holocene? The answer requires us to look at what the world looked like 12,000 years ago. During the last glacial maximum and the Younger Dryas, sea levels were approximately 120 meters lower than they are today. That's nearly 400 feet of water that simply wasn't in the oceans yet. It was locked up in ice sheets covering Canada, Northern Europe, and parts of Asia. With sea levels that much lower, the world's coastlines looked completely different. The continental shelves, those underwater extensions of the continents that slope gradually before dropping off to the deep ocean floor, were above water. Dry land. Consider what that means for human geography. The Bering Strait, that narrow water passage between Alaska and Siberia, was a land bridge hundreds of miles wide. Beringia, it's called, a vast grassland connecting Asia and North America, allowing free movement of people and animals. Britain wasn't an island. It was connected to continental Europe by Doggerland, a low-lying plain that's now under the North Sea. Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand were connected to Asia by the Sunda Shelf, creating a massive subcontinent called Sundaland. Australia, Tasmania, and New Guinea were joined in a single landmass called Sahul. And most intriguingly, many of the areas that are now shallow seas, close to the current coastlines, were extensive lowland plains, river valleys, and coastal zones, exactly the kind of environment where early civilizations would develop. Access to water, fertile soil from river deposits, marine resources, moderate climate. Now imagine a civilization developing on these now submerged coastal plains during the relatively warmer period before the Younger Dryas. They would have had thousands of years to develop agriculture, complex societies, architectural knowledge, astronomical science, all the markers of civilization. When the Younger Dryas hit, temperatures plummeted. Ice sheets advanced. But more importantly for our hypothetical coastal civilization, the ocean might have behaved strangely. There's evidence of short-term sea level fluctuations during this period, possibly related to the catastrophic drainage of glacial lakes, to ice dam failures, to the complex dynamics of a climate system in crisis. If you were a coastal civilization, even a sophisticated one, and your lands were subject to flooding, to climate instability, to the failure of agricultural systems due to sudden temperature drops, what would you do? You'd retreat inland. You'd migrate. You'd seek refuge in areas less affected by the chaos. And you'd try to preserve your knowledge. The Younger Dryas ended suddenly, perhaps in as little as a decade in some regions. Temperatures shot up. The ice retreated. And the oceans began to rise. Not slowly. Not gradually. In pulses. As massive ice dams failed, as glacial lakes drained, as the Laurentide ice sheet over North America collapsed in stages, the sea level rose in catastrophic surges separated by periods of stability. There's geological evidence for these pulses, submerged reef formations that show multiple stages of growth and drowning, sediment layers that indicate sudden flooding events, ancient shorelines now far below current sea level, each marking a pause in the relentless rise of the water. For any civilization living on coastal plains, on river deltas, on the continental shelves, this would have been apocalyptic. Not a single flood, but waves of inundation over centuries, each one forcing retreat, each one drowning settlements, farmlands, entire regions. The survivors would have migrated inland, moving to higher ground. And in doing so, they would have encountered the other survivors, the inland populations who had weathered the Younger Dryas in upland refugia, in caves, in mountainous regions. Populations that had regressed technologically during the long cold but were now beginning to emerge and expand as the world warmed. And this is where the knowledge transfer would have occurred. Picture this encounter from both perspectives. The inland survivors, your ancestors and mine, emerging from 1,000 years of hardship. They've maintained fire, basic tools, hunting and gathering skills, oral traditions, art, all the fundamental human capacities. But complex social organization, monumental architecture, agricultural science, writing, these things have faded or never developed in their isolated, resource-constrained environment. They see strange people arriving from the lowlands. These newcomers speak differently, dress differently, carry objects whose purpose is mysterious. They possess knowledge about plants, which ones to cultivate, when to plant them, how to irrigate. They understand the movements of the stars and can predict seasons. They can work stone with precision, can organize labor for large projects, can record information in symbols carved on stone or pressed into clay. To the inland survivors, these newcomers would seem almost magical. Other special. Over generations, as the stories are told and retold, as the actual historical details blur and fade, these teacher figures would naturally be elevated in cultural memory. They would become gods, culture heroes, the ones who brought the gifts of civilization from the heavens or the sea. From the perspective of the coastal survivors, the remnants of the older civilization, they're refugees. They've lost their homeland to the rising waters. They've watched their cities drown, their agricultural lands submerge, their civilization fragment and scatter. They carry their knowledge with them, but they're no longer a unified culture. Their diaspora, spreading across the highlands, settling in different regions, establishing contact with different local populations. And perhaps they make a choice, conscious or unconscious, to teach, to share what they know, to prevent the total loss of everything their ancestors built. So they teach agriculture to the people of the Fertile Crescent. They share astronomical knowledge that becomes encoded in Sumerian mathematics. They help construct monuments that align with celestial events, teaching the principles of architecture and engineering in the process. They do the same in the Nile Valley, on the Indian subcontinent, in China, in Southeast Asia, in the Americas, wherever they make landfall, wherever they establish contact with local populations. Over time, their distinct identity fades. They intermarry with local populations. Their language blends with local tongues. Their cultural practices merge with indigenous traditions. Within a few generations, they're no longer a separate people. They're absorbed, integrated, their knowledge disseminated, but their identity dissolved. What remains is the knowledge itself, and the fading memory of where it came from. This scenario, a diaspora of a drowned coastal civilization bringing knowledge to scattered inland populations in the early Holocene, fits the evidence better than pure coincidence or independent invention. It explains the timing, why civilization appears suddenly across multiple continents, immediately following the Younger Dryas and the subsequent sea level rise. It explains the similarities, why we see common architectural forms, shared mythological motifs, parallel mathematical systems, similar agricultural practices emerging in supposedly isolated cultures. It explains the myths, why nearly every culture has stories of teachers arriving from the sea or sky after a great flood, bringing knowledge and then vanishing. It explains the anomalies, why the earliest civilizations sometimes display more sophistication than their supposed developmental stage would predict, and why quality sometimes declines in later periods as the inherited knowledge is imperfectly understood or partially forgotten. But if we accept this hypothesis, even tentatively, we must ask, where is the physical evidence? Where are the ruins of this precursor civilization? The answer is underwater. Approximately 27 million square kilometers of land, an area roughly the size of Africa, was submerged when the ice melted and sea levels rose 120 meters. That's 27 million square kilometers of potential settlement area that we have barely explored. Marine archaeology is expensive, time-consuming, and technologically challenging. Most of the effort has focused on shipwrecks and classical-era ports, not on searching the continental shelves for evidence of pre-Holocene habitation. But in the limited areas where researchers have looked, they've found tantalizing hints. In 2001, using sonar scanning, researchers discovered geometric structures on the seafloor in the Gulf of Khambhat, off the coast of India, at a depth of approximately 40 meters. The sonar images showed what appeared to be rectilinear foundations, grid-like city planning, and massive stone structures. Artifacts dredged from the site included pottery, beads, and pieces of worked wood that, when carbon-dated, returned ages of 8,500 to 9,500 years old. The findings remain controversial. Many archaeologists argue that the sonar images show natural formations, that the artifacts could have been transported there by currents, that the carbon dating might reflect the age of the materials rather than the structures themselves. But controversy means the question is open. It means we don't know for certain. In the 1960s, and again in more detailed surveys in the 1990s, researchers exploring the waters near the Bahamas discovered the Bimini Road, a linear arrangement of rectangular limestone blocks stretching for nearly half a mile along the seafloor. Some researchers argue it's a constructed feature, a pier or road from a period when the area was above water. Skeptics contend it's a natural formation, beach rock that fractured along natural plains to create the block-like appearance. Again, controversy, uncertainty, but also a reminder that our shallow seas are not empty. They contain features that provoke debate, that challenge our assumptions about where and when humans built things. Offshore from Yonaguni, we already discussed the monument, those underwater terraces and right angles that might be natural, might be modified, or might be entirely carved by human hands thousands of years before Japan's historically recognized civilizations. in the Mediterranean, in the Atlantic, in the Indian Ocean, in the seas around Southeast Asia. Wherever researchers have conducted systematic underwater surveys, they've occasionally discovered anomalies. Sonar contacts that suggest geometry. Stone arrangements that provoke questions. Artifacts in contexts that don't quite fit the established timeline. None of this is conclusive. None of it proves the existence of a lost civilization. But it suggests something important. We haven't looked everywhere. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence when we've barely begun to search the 27 million square kilometers of land that drowned. Let's turn to another form of evidence, genetics. Human population genetics has revolutionized our understanding of ancient migrations, contacts, and cultural exchanges. By analyzing DNA from modern populations and from ancient remains, researchers can trace lineages, identify admixture events, and even pinpoint when different populations separated and reconnected. The picture that emerges is complex. It shows humanity as a dynamic, mobile, interconnected species, not isolated. Groups developing in parallel, but populations constantly mixing, migrating, exchanging genes, and, presumably, knowledge. One of the most intriguing findings is the evidence of what geneticists call ghost populations, ancestral groups whose DNA signature appears in modern populations but for which we have no direct archaeological evidence. These ghost populations interbred with known groups at some point in the past, contributing genetic material, and then either died out, were absorbed, or migrated elsewhere, leaving no trace except in the genomes they left behind. The most famous example is the Denisovans. We have exactly one well-preserved Denisovan fossil, a finger bone from Denisova cave in Siberia, plus a few teeth and bone fragments. Yet genetic analysis reveals that Denisovans once lived across a vast range of Asia and interbred with modern humans, contributing DNA that persists in Melanesian, Australian Aboriginal, and Southeast Asian populations today. From a handful of bone fragments, we've reconstructed the existence of an entire human lineage that was unknown until 2010. What else might we be missing? Recent genetic studies of Native American populations have revealed unexpected admixture events, traces of genetic material that don't fit the simple, crossed the Bering Land Bridge 15,000 years ago model. Some populations carry genetic markers that suggest contact with peoples from Oceania, from Europe, or from other sources not accounted for in the standard migration models. These findings are controversial, hotly debated, and often tentative. But they consistently point in the same direction. Human population history is more complex, more interconnected, more dynamic than the tidy continental isolation models suggest. If there was a maritime-adapted population during the late Pleistocene, a coastal civilization spread across the now-submerged continental shelves, their genetic signature might well appear in modern populations as trace admixture, ghost lineages, unexplained connections between geographically distant groups. We might not be able to identify them as a distinct population, especially if they were absorbed into larger groups during the Holocene. But their genetic legacy could persist as subtle signals in the DNA of their descendants. Now consider language. Linguists have long noted that reconstructing proto-languages, the ancestral tongues from which modern language families descend, becomes increasingly difficult the farther back you go. But some linguists have attempted to identify deeper relationships, proposing superfamilies that might link languages we currently consider unrelated. The proto-human language hypothesis, the idea that all human languages might ultimately descend from a single ancestral tongue spoken in Africa before the Great Migrations, is speculative but not unreasonable given human genetic origins. But here's something curious. Certain words appear in languages across different families, in contexts that suggest they might be very ancient borrowings or remnants of older linguistic layers. The word for dog, for instance, shows surprising similarities across unrelated language families. The mathematical term dozen, meaning 12, might relate to very old base 12 counting systems that appear in various cultures. Names for celestial bodies sometimes show unexpected parallels. These could be coincidences, false cognates that emerged independently, or they could be linguistic fossils, words that were shared during contact events so ancient that the languages have otherwise diverged beyond recognition. If a technologically advanced population made contact with multiple scattered groups in the early Holocene, they would have left linguistic traces, loan words, borrowed technical terms, names for new concepts they introduced. Those borrowings would have been absorbed into the local languages, evolving over millennia, becoming so transformed that their common origin is nearly impossible to detect with current linguistic methods. Nearly impossible. But perhaps not entirely. There's another angle to explore: shared symbols and iconography. The swastika, before it was tragically appropriated by Nazi ideology, was one of the most widespread symbols in the ancient world. It appears in Hindu and Buddhist iconography, in ancient Greek and Roman mosaics, in Celtic art, among Native American peoples, in Japanese temples, in African textiles. It's an ancient solar symbol, generally associated with good fortune, the sun's rotation, the cycles of nature. Why would this specific geometric form, a cross with arms bent at right angles in the same rotational direction, appear independently across cultures that had no contact? The standard explanation is that it's a simple geometric form that humans might naturally create and imbue with meaning. And that's plausible. But the swastika isn't the only example. The spiral motif appears in Neolithic art across Europe, in ancient Sumerian iconography, in Celtic carvings, in Maori tattoos, in Native American petroglyphs, in Dogon art, in ancient Chinese jade artifacts. The triple spiral or triskelion appears in ancient Greek art, in Celtic stone carvings like those at Newgrange in Ireland, dated to 3200 BCE, and in various other contexts across Eurasia. Concentric circles, often interpreted as solar or water symbols, appear on petroglyphs and pottery across every inhabited continent. These are not complex, culturally specific images. They're fundamental geometric forms. And the argument that humans naturally create such symbols is reasonable. But consider the contexts in which they appear. Often, these symbols are associated with sacred sites, with astronomical alignments, with places of ritual significance. They're not random doodles. They're deliberate, placed with intention, repeated across generations. What if they're markers? What if certain symbols were taught as part of the knowledge transfer, used to indicate astronomical alignments, seasonal markers, sacred mathematics? The people who received these symbols might not have fully understood their original meaning, but they recognized their importance, their connection to the knowledge the teachers brought. So they reproduced them, incorporated them into their own cultural contexts, passed them down. Over time, the original meaning faded, but the symbols persisted, becoming abstract representations of concepts like sun, water, life, continuity, cycles, the fundamental ideas around which early agricultural societies organized their understanding of the cosmos. Let's examine the evidence from megalithic construction more systematically. Around the world, from approximately 10,000 BCE to 2000 BCE, cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other engaged in remarkably similar architectural projects, moving massive stones, often across considerable distances, and erecting them in patterns that align with astronomical events. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, 9600 BC, massive T-shaped pillars arranged in circles, astronomical alignments. The megalithic temples of Malta, 3600 to 2500 BC, among the oldest freestanding structures in the world, featuring precise stonework and astronomical orientations. Stonehenge in England, constructed in multiple phases from approximately 3000 BC to 1600 BC, the famous sarsen stones aligned to the solstices, the blue stones transported from Wales over 150 miles away. The Carnac stones in France, approximately 3300 to 4500 BC, thousands of standing stones arranged in rows, patterns, and circles, precise purpose still debated but clearly intentional and organized. Newgrange in Ireland, approximately 3200 BCE, a passage tomb constructed so that the rising sun on the winter solstice illuminates the inner chamber, requiring sophisticated astronomical knowledge and engineering. The Great Pyramid and other structures at Giza in Egypt, approximately 2560 BCE, demonstrating mathematical precision, astronomical alignment, and organizational capacity that still impresses modern engineers. Tiwanaku and Pumapunku in Bolivia, approximately 500 C in their final form, but possibly with much older foundations, featuring megalithic stonework with precision-cut blocks and sophisticated water management systems. Ollantaytambo in Peru, Inca period site incorporating megalithic walls with massive stones fitted so precisely that reconstruction attempts have failed to replicate the technique. Machu Picchu, built around 1450 CE, but utilizing stonework techniques that seem to exceed the known capabilities of the Inca period. The Moai platforms on Easter Island, approximately 1400 to 1650 CE, massive stone figures on precisely constructed bases, transported across the island using methods that remain debated. Nan Madol in Micronesia, approximately 1200 to 1500 CE, an artificial archipelago constructed from massive basalt logs stacked to create platforms and structures, built in the middle of the ocean with no apparent local source for the stones. Angkor Wat in Cambodia, 12th century CE, but part of a larger complex with earlier phases, demonstrating sophisticated urban planning, hydraulic engineering, and astronomical alignment. This is not a complete list. There are hundreds of megalithic sites worldwide. The examples above represent different time periods, different continents, different cultures. But they share common features. Use of stones far larger than functionally necessary. Precision in cutting, fitting, and alignment that exceeds what would be required for basic structural stability. Astronomical orientations linking the structures to solstices, equinoxes, or specific stellar positions. Evidence of sophisticated planning and organizational capacity. Often, oral traditions suggesting the knowledge was inherited or taught rather than developed locally. The standard archaeological explanation is that megalithic construction represents a particular phase in cultural development, a way societies demonstrate power, organize labor, and express cosmological beliefs. That's undoubtedly part of the truth. But it doesn't fully explain the similarities in technique across cultures that had no contact. Why did cultures around the world independently decide that the way to honor their gods or mark astronomical events was to move impossibly heavy stones and arrange them with precision? If megalithic construction is simply a natural phase of cultural development, we should see more variation. We should see some cultures building with wood, others with brick, others piling up earthen mounds, others constructing monuments from smaller, more manageable stones. And we do see some of that variation. But the specific phenomenon of megalithic construction, massive stones, precise fitting, astronomical alignment, appears with suspicious consistency. What if the similarity isn't coincidence or convergent evolution, but evidence of transmission? What if the idea of megalithic construction as a way to mark astronomical events and encode knowledge was taught, demonstrated, spread by the same diaspora population we've been discussing? Consider what a megalithic monument actually accomplishes. It's permanent. Stone lasts. Even if a culture collapses, even if the language is lost, even if the oral traditions fade, the stones remain. Future generations, future cultures, can observe them, can rediscover their astronomical alignments, can use them to relearn the cycles of the sun and stars. If you were a civilization in decline, watching your homeland drown, scattering across the world into small groups that would inevitably be absorbed by larger local populations, how would you preserve your knowledge? Writing is good, but it requires continuity of literacy. If the next generation can't read your script, your knowledge is lost. Oral tradition is resilient, but it degrades over time, subject to the distortions of memory and cultural change. But a stone monument, aligned to the solstice, demonstrating principles of geometry and astronomy through its very structure, that's a teaching tool that doesn't require language or literacy. It stands there, mute but eloquent, waiting for observers to notice the sun's position, to count the days between events, to discover the mathematical relationships encoded in its proportions. It's a gift to the future. And perhaps that's what these monuments are. Not just temples or tombs or status symbols, though they surely served those functions for the cultures that built them. But fundamentally, they're educational devices, constructed to preserve and transmit knowledge across vast spans of time, surviving changes in language, culture, and population. If that's true, then the people who taught megalithic construction to scattered Holocene populations were doing something remarkably far-sighted. They were ensuring that even if their own civilization was lost, even if the memory of them faded to myth, the knowledge itself would persist, encoded in stone, waiting to be rediscovered. Now let's address the obvious objection to this entire hypothesis. Why isn't there more evidence? If a sophisticated civilization existed before the Younger Dryas, even if most of their settlements are now underwater, shouldn't we find more traces? Shouldn't there be artifacts, tools, skeletal remains, something definitively older than the orthodox timeline allows? Several answers to this. First, we may have found such evidence and misinterpreted it. The history of archaeology is full of discoveries that were initially dismissed, ignored, or explained away because they didn't fit the prevailing paradigm. It's only later, when enough anomalous evidence accumulates, that interpretations shift. Second, preservation is a significant issue. Organic materials, wood, fiber, leather, even bone in many environments, decay completely within thousands of years. What survives is stone, ceramics, metals in some cases. If we're looking for evidence from 12,000 plus years ago, we're largely limited to stone tools and structures. But stone tools are difficult to date. You can't radiocarbon date the stone itself. You can only date organic materials found in association with the tools. And sophisticated stone tools, finely crafted blades, polished axes, precision points, look remarkably similar whether they're 20,000 years old or 5,000 years old. Without contextual dating, we might not recognize an anomalously old sophisticated tool. Third, the sheer scope of underwater terrain we haven't explored. I mentioned this earlier, but it bears repeating. We've explored more of the moon's surface than we have of the seafloor on our own planet. The shallow continental shelf areas, the submerged coastal plains where early civilizations would have developed, are covered in sediment, thick layers of mud deposited over millennia. Finding structures or artifacts under meters of sediment, beneath dozens of meters of water, requires specialized equipment, funding, and often a specific reason to look in a particular location. We don't have systematic surveys of most of the world's continental shelves. We have fragmentary data, limited searches, occasional discoveries. It's entirely possible that extensive remains of pre-Holocene coastal settlements exist on the seafloor, and we simply haven't found them yet because we haven't looked in the right places or because they're buried under sediment we haven't penetrated. Fourth, there's the question of what a pre-Younger Dryas civilization might have looked like. We tend to imagine ancient civilizations in terms of the ones we know: Mesopotamian cities with monumental architecture, Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts. We imagine that civilization means stone buildings, metal tools, writing systems. But what if the civilization we're looking for didn't build with stone, at least not in their earlier phases? What if they built with wood, with earth, with materials that decay? Wooden structures, no matter how sophisticated, leave almost no trace after thousands of years unless they're preserved in very specific conditions: waterlogged, frozen, desiccated. A city built entirely of wood, engulfed by rising seas 11,000 years ago, would leave virtually no evidence on the seafloor today. The wood would rot, the site would be covered in sediment, and without already knowing it was there, you'd never find it. Consider the sophistication of the Neolithic Japanese culture that produced the Jomon period sites. For thousands of years, from approximately 14,000 BCE to 300 BCE, the Jomon people created pottery of astonishing artistry, built sophisticated settlements, engaged in complex ritual practices. Yet they didn't build monumental stone architecture. They didn't smelt metals for most of their history. They didn't develop writing. If we only had their stone tools, and not the favorable preservation conditions that saved their pottery and village sites, we might not recognize them as the sophisticated culture they clearly were. The hypothetical pre-Younger Dryas civilization might have been similar. Sophisticated in knowledge, astronomy, mathematics, agriculture, navigation, without necessarily leaving the kind of durable architectural signature we associate with advanced civilizations. They might have been a maritime culture, masters of boat building and navigation, which would explain how their knowledge dispersed globally. Boats, even sophisticated ones, don't survive millennia. They decay, sink, vanish. So the absence of abundant physical evidence isn't necessarily fatal to the hypothesis. It's what we'd expect for a coastal, possibly wood-building maritime culture that was submerged 11,000 years ago. But there's another form of evidence we haven't fully explored: astronomical knowledge encoded in ancient structures and texts. The precision with which ancient cultures tracked celestial cycles often exceeds what would be necessary for basic agricultural calendars or religious festivals. It suggests either very long periods of continuous observation or the inheritance of knowledge accumulated over such periods. The Mayan long count calendar, for instance, tracks cycles stretching over 5,125 years. Its starting point, marked as 0.0.0.0.0 in their notation, corresponds to August 11, 3114 BCE in our calendar. Why that specific date? What significance did it hold? And how did the Maya develop a calendar system of such sophistication? The standard explanation is that the Maya developed their calendar through centuries of astronomical observation and mathematical refinement, and that the starting date represents a mythological creation event rather than a historical marker. But some researchers have noted that the Mayan calendar's level of precision, particularly in tracking Venus cycles and eclipse patterns, suggests knowledge that would require many centuries, perhaps millennia, of continuous observation and record-keeping to accumulate. If the Maya inherited some of this knowledge from earlier cultures that were themselves inheritors of older traditions, the sophistication becomes more understandable. The Vedic texts of ancient India contain astronomical references that some scholars argue are much older than the texts themselves, describing celestial configurations that, if calculated backwards, point to dates between 4000 BCE and 7000 BC. The precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that causes the position of the stars to shift over thousands of years, is understood and referenced in some interpretations of these ancient texts. Knowledge of precession requires either very long periods of careful observation or the inheritance of records spanning thousands of years. The conventional history of Indian civilization doesn't provide that kind of continuity, suggesting either that the astronomical references in the Vedas are symbolic rather than literal, or that they encode knowledge much older than the texts themselves. The Egyptian calendar, with its 365-day year, was remarkably accurate for its time. But more intriguingly, the layout of the Giza pyramids has been argued by some researchers to mirror the position of the stars in Orion's belt, not as they appeared when the pyramids were built around 2560 BCE, but as they would have appeared around 10,500 BCE due to precession. This correlation, popularized by Robert Bauval in the Orion correlation theory, remains controversial. Many Egyptologists dispute the alignment or argue that it's coincidental. But the theory raises an interesting question. If the Egyptians were encoding astronomical knowledge in their monuments, how far back were they looking? What were they trying to preserve or commemorate? There's also the puzzle of the Sphinx. Geologist Robert Schoch has argued, based on weathering patterns on the Sphinx enclosure, that the structure might be thousands of years older than conventionally dated, possibly carved during a wetter climate period that would place it before the Sahara became a desert. His analysis suggests water erosion rather than wind erosion, which would require sustained rainfall of the sort the region hasn't experienced since before the Younger Dryas. This claim is hotly disputed by Egyptologists, who point to inscriptions, archaeological context, and stylistic analysis that place the Sphinx firmly in the 4th dynasty, contemporary with the pyramids. But the debate itself is significant. It shows that even well-studied monuments can harbor mysteries, that our dating and interpretation methods aren't infallible, that legitimate scientific questions remain about the origins of structures we thought we understood. Let me be clear. I'm not arguing that any single one of these controversial theories is definitively correct. The underwater structures off India might be natural. The Sphinx might be exactly as old as mainstream Egyptology claims. The Orion correlation might be coincidental or misinterpreted. But collectively, these anomalies, debates, and unresolved questions point to something important. Our understanding of human prehistory is incomplete. There are gaps in our knowledge. There are structures we can't fully explain. There are myths that might contain historical cores we've dismissed as fantasy. And when we compile all of this, the flood myths, the teacher figures, the sudden appearance of civilization, the megalithic construction, the astronomical knowledge, the genetic ghost populations, the submerged coastal plains, a picture begins to emerge. Not a definitive picture, not proof, but a hypothesis that deserves serious consideration. The hypothesis is this: a human civilization, maritime and sophisticated, developed on the coastal plains and continental shelves during the milder periods before and during the last glacial maximum. This wasn't a global empire, more likely a network of related cultures, sharing knowledge and genetic heritage, adapted to coastal and marine environments. When the Younger Dryas struck, bringing 1,200 years of renewed glaciation and climate chaos, this civilization faced catastrophic challenges. Sea levels fluctuated. Coastlines changed. Agricultural systems failed. Populations fragmented. Some communities may have been destroyed entirely. Others retreated inland, migrating to upland regions where they could survive but couldn't maintain the full complexity of their coastal culture. A few centers may have maintained continuity, preserving crucial knowledge through the long cold, waiting for the climate to stabilize. When the Younger Dryas ended and temperatures warmed rapidly, the ice sheets melted in pulses, causing sea levels to rise in catastrophic surges. The coastal plains, the river deltas, the shelf areas where this civilization had thrived, all drowned. Cities, farmlands, entire cultural landscapes submerged beneath meters of rising ocean. The survivors, scattered across the highlands and inland regions, found themselves in a world that had changed. Their homeland was gone, drowned beneath the waves. Their population was fractured, no longer able to maintain the complex social structures of the pre-flood period. But they still had knowledge. Astronomy, agriculture, mathematics, navigation, construction techniques, the organization of labor for large projects. And they encountered populations of inland survivors, people who had never lived on the coasts, who had weathered the Younger Dryas in caves and upland refugia, who were beginning to expand now that the climate was favorable again. The coastal refugees, our hypothetical teachers, shared their knowledge with these populations. Perhaps out of altruism, perhaps out of necessity for survival in a world where they were now the minority. They taught the fundamentals of agriculture, sharing seeds and techniques. They taught astronomical observation, showing how to track the seasons and predict climatic cycles. They helped construct monuments that encoded this knowledge in durable form, ensuring it wouldn't be entirely lost even as their own distinct culture dissolved into the larger populations. Over generations, the refugees were absorbed. Their genetic signature diluted into larger gene pools. Their language blended with local tongues. Their cultural identity faded. What remained was the knowledge itself, and the myths, the fading memories of teachers who came from the sea, who brought the gifts of civilization, who then vanished into history. This hypothesis explains the patterns we see in the archaeological and mythological record. The sudden appearance of agriculture and complex societies. The spread of similar technologies and architectural styles across unconnected continents. The flood myths and teacher figures that appear in nearly every cultural tradition. The astronomical knowledge that seems too sophisticated for cultures supposedly at the beginning of their development. It doesn't require lost super technologies or ancient astronauts or mystical Atlantean crystals. It just requires humans, clever, adaptive, knowledge-accumulating humans, who developed civilization earlier than we thought, in places we haven't looked, and who shared their knowledge when their world drowned. This is not a fringe hypothesis. Or rather, it shouldn't be. It's based on the same principles and evidence types that archaeology uses for more recent periods. We know humans were capable of sophisticated behavior 40,000 years ago. We have the cave art to prove it. We know they had the cognitive capacity for language, symbolic thought, forward planning. Why is it so difficult to imagine that, given favorable conditions, some populations might have developed agricultural and architectural sophistication 15,000 or 20,000 years ago, during the warmer periods before the Younger Dryas? The main obstacle isn't evidence, it's paradigm. It's the deeply ingrained story of civilization as beginning in Mesopotamia around 4000 BCE, with everything before that being prehistory, primitive, simple. But paradigms shift. They shift when enough anomalous evidence accumulates that the old model can no longer accommodate the data without increasingly convoluted explanations. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe already forced a paradigm shift. Before its excavation, the consensus was that monumental architecture required settled agricultural societies, which came first, followed by the development of complex religion and the construction of temples. Göbekli Tepe reversed that sequence. It's a monumental religious site built by people who were apparently still mobile hunter-gatherers, or at most in transition to agriculture. The sophisticated symbolic content of the carvings, the organizational capacity required to move and erect those stones, the evidence of ritual feasting, all of this emerged before settled villages, before domesticated crops. The discovery forced archaeologists to reconsider the relationship between sedentism, agriculture, and complex society. It showed that the old linear model, first farming, then surplus, then complexity, was too simple. If Göbekli Tepe can overturn decades of archaeological consensus, what might we discover if we seriously searched the continental shelves? If we devoted resources to underwater archaeology in the regions that would have been prime habitation areas 15,000 years ago? We might find nothing. The hypothesis might be wrong. But we might find something that forces another, even larger paradigm shift. And that brings us to the question of motivation. Why does this matter? Why should we care whether there was a precursor civilization or not? Why does it matter if knowledge was shared or independently developed? It matters because it changes how we understand ourselves. If human civilization is merely 6,000 years old, we're infants in cosmic terms. We're a species that stumbled out of the caves yesterday and today holds nuclear weapons. We're brilliant but inexperienced, powerful but immature. But if human civilization is potentially 15,000 or 20,000 years old, if we've been through cycles of rise and collapse before, if we've built and lost and rebuilt, then we're a mature species with a long memory, even if that memory is fragmented and mythologized. It changes our sense of trajectory. Are we ascending toward ever greater heights, or are we recovering from a fall? Are we discovering new knowledge, or remembering old knowledge? It changes how we interpret our own mythologies. If the flood stories are memories of real events, what else in our myths might be historical? What other legends might preserve actual experiences of our ancestors? It changes how we think about knowledge preservation and loss. We live in an age of digital information, where the sum of human knowledge is supposedly at our fingertips. But digital data is fragile, dependent on infrastructure, on electrical grids, on maintenance of servers and systems. If our civilization faced a catastrophic disruption, how much of our knowledge would survive? How would we encode what matters most in forms that could outlast us? The megalithic builders might have understood this problem better than we do. There's another dimension to this that we haven't fully explored. The question of why the hypothetical precursor civilization disappeared, not just physically, drowned beneath the waves, but why their knowledge was only partially transmitted, why subsequent societies had to rediscover so much. If these teachers were real, if they spent generations sharing knowledge with scattered post-Younger Dryas populations, why didn't that knowledge take root more completely? Why did subsequent civilizations have to slowly redevelop mathematics, astronomy, architecture? Why was there such a long gap between, say, Göbekli Tepe in 9600 BCE and the rise of Mesopotamian cities around 4000 BC? Part of the answer is probably demographic. If the coastal civilization was relatively small in population, perhaps a few 100,000 people spread across the now submerged shelf areas, and they were absorbed into inland populations numbering in the millions, their genetic and cultural contribution would be diluted. Imagine a scenario where a few thousand refugees, carrying sophisticated knowledge, encounter a population of 100,000 people who have very different cultural practices and survival strategies adapted to their upland environment. Even if the refugees are respected, even if their knowledge is valued, it can only be transmitted as fast as the receiving population can absorb and apply it. And knowledge transfer isn't automatic. It requires not just teaching, but the social and economic conditions that make the knowledge useful and worth maintaining. Agricultural knowledge, for instance, requires settled life. If a population is still mobile, moving with seasonal resources, they can't apply intensive agricultural techniques. The knowledge might be taught, might even be remembered, but it won't be practiced until conditions favor sedentism. Astronomical knowledge requires leisure time, resources to build observatories or monuments, and a social structure that values such knowledge enough to support the specialists who maintain it. A population focused on immediate survival won't prioritize tracking the precession of the equinoxes. So the knowledge might have been shared, but only the portions immediately applicable would be adopted. The rest would be remembered imperfectly, transmitted as stories and myths, waiting for later generations to rediscover their practical significance. There's also the problem of specialization. In any complex society, knowledge is distributed. You don't need everyone to understand advanced mathematics, you need a few specialists who can perform calculations and teach apprentices. You don't need everyone to understand astronomy, you need a priestly class or astronomer caste that maintains the observations. If the coastal civilization was hierarchical, with specialized knowledge held by elites, and those elites died disproportionately during the catastrophes, drowned in the floods, killed during migrations, unable to survive in unfamiliar upland environments, the knowledge could be lost even if the general population survived. It's also possible that some knowledge was deliberately restricted. Many traditional societies closely guard esoteric knowledge, revealing it only to initiates, only to those who have proven themselves worthy. If the surviving coastal refugees maintained similar restrictions, they might have been unwilling to share everything, or might have required long apprenticeships that few inland people could commit to. Over time, as the original refugees died and their descendants became increasingly integrated into local cultures, the restricted knowledge would fade, remembered only in fragments, in ritual practices whose original meaning was forgotten. This pattern, knowledge preserved in ritual without understanding, is common in cultural transmission. We see it in religious practices worldwide, ceremonies performed precisely because this is how it's always been done, even when participants no longer know why it's done that way. The ritual itself becomes the memory, a placeholder preserving the form if not the content of ancient knowledge. Consider the Catholic Massachusetts. Its structure, language, and ritual objects preserve elements from the early Christian Church, which in turn borrowed from Jewish temple practices, which themselves echoed older Near Eastern religious patterns. A modern Catholic priest performs rituals whose full historical depth even he might not fully comprehend, but the form persists, transmitted across 2 millennia. Now imagine that process over 10,000 years, with the original meaning lost entirely, with only the form remaining. That might be what we're seeing in some ancient practices, the fossil forms of knowledge transfer, where the ritual outlived the understanding. There's also a darker possibility we should consider, that the knowledge was rejected. Not all contact between cultures is friendly. Not all knowledge transfer is welcomed. If the coastal refugees were perceived as outsiders, as competitors for resources, as threatening to existing social hierarchies, their knowledge might have been deliberately rejected or suppressed. Oral traditions from various indigenous cultures contain stories of conflicts with outsiders, of wars between different peoples, of invasions and displacements. The smooth narrative of benevolent teachers being warmly received might be an idealization. Reality was probably messier. Some groups might have welcomed the knowledge. Others might have resisted, fought, driven the refugees away. The knowledge that survived would be that which was shared in successful encounters, which was adopted by receptive populations, which proved immediately useful. The rest would be lost in the conflicts, in the migrations, in the long, slow process of cultural absorption and forgetting. And let's not discount simple catastrophe. Even after the Younger Dryas ended, the early Holocene was not climatically stable. There were droughts, floods, volcanic eruptions, continued pulses of sea level rise. Populations that had begun to apply the new knowledge might have been disrupted before they could fully establish the practices, forcing them back to simpler survival strategies. Knowledge, once lost, is hard to recover. It took humanity thousands of years to redevelop writing after the Bronze Age collapse destroyed the literate civilizations of the Mediterranean. The knowledge of concrete construction, perfected by the Romans, was lost in Western Europe after the empire's fall and had to be rediscovered in the modern era. If early Holocene populations just beginning to apply agricultural and architectural knowledge taught by the coastal refugees suffered their own local catastrophes, they might have lost that knowledge, leaving only fragments in myth and ritual. All of which is to say, the hypothesis of a precursor civilization sharing knowledge doesn't require that the knowledge transfer was perfect or complete. In fact, the patchy, fragmentary nature of the knowledge in early civilizations, sudden appearances followed by long periods of slow development, high sophistication in some areas and primitiveness in others, is exactly what we'd expect from imperfect transmission across cultural and temporal boundaries. It's the difference between intact transmission, like a library passing complete books to the next generation, and garbled transmission, like a game of telephone played over 10,000 years. The message gets through, but it's corrupted, simplified, misunderstood. You get fragments, stories about gods who taught agriculture, rituals whose purpose is forgotten, monuments encoding astronomy that builders no longer fully comprehend. You get Göbekli Tepe, a monument so sophisticated it seems impossible for its time, built by people who then don't quite continue that level of sophistication in immediately subsequent generations. You get Sumerian mathematics, fully formed, elegant, appearing without evident precedent. You get myths that all tell the same story but in different languages, with different details, as if describing a real event from different perspectives, filtered through different cultural lenses. You get us, here, now, looking back across the distance of millennia, trying to reconstruct what happened, knowing something is missing from the story but not quite able to prove what. Let's talk about some specific mythological accounts that might preserve memories of this knowledge transfer, examining them with a more literal interpretation than usually applied. The Mesopotamian Apko, which I mentioned earlier, are described in Sumerian and Babylonian texts as 7 sages who emerged from the sea before the flood. They're credited with teaching humanity the principles of civilization, agriculture, writing, law, temple construction, ritual practice. Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing in Greek in the 3rd century BCE, provides detailed descriptions. He names the first Apkallu as Oannes, describing him as amphibious, a creature with the head and body of a fish but with human features, who could speak. Each day, Oannes would emerge from the sea to teach, and each night would return to the water. Modern scholars interpret this as purely mythological, possibly representing a priestly caste that wore fish-scale cloaks as ritual garments. But what if Berossus, recording traditions already ancient in his time, was preserving a memory of actual contact? Not with fish people, but with maritime experts, people who spent so much time on the water, who were so associated with the sea that they were symbolically represented as fish beings. People who literally came from the sea, from drowned coastal lands, from a maritime culture that inland populations would have found foreign and strange. The detail that Oannes taught during the day and returned to the sea at night could preserve a memory of actual practice. Teachers who maintained their own separate settlements, possibly on boats or islands, keeping their distance from the populations they were instructing, not fully integrating but maintaining their distinct identity. Over time, as the literal facts faded, the symbolic representation, fish people, amphibious beings, became the story, the original literal meaning lost. The same interpretive approach can be applied to Quetzalcoatl in Mesoamerican tradition. He's described as bearded, light-skinned, arriving from the sea in the east. He teaches agriculture, particularly the cultivation of maize. He teaches calendar keeping, astronomy, writing. He establishes laws and moral codes. Then he departs, sailing away to the east, promising to return. The conventional interpretation, a mythological figure, possibly later confused with Spanish conquistadors, particularly Cortés, whose arrival was initially interpreted through the lens of the return prophecy. But elements of the Quetzalcoatl narrative predate the Spanish by thousands of years. The Olmecs, the oldest Mesoamerican civilization, already had representations of feathered serpents by 1200 BC. The Maya and later the Aztecs inherited and elaborated the tradition. What if Quetzalcoatl preserves a memory of actual contact with maritime peoples who arrived in Mesoamerica from elsewhere? Possibly from the Caribbean, possibly even from across the Pacific. The detail of maize cultivation is interesting. Maize was domesticated from Tia Sinti, a wild grass, somewhere in southern Mexico around 7000 BC. The process of domestication required sophisticated botanical knowledge and many generations of selective breeding. Tia Sinti doesn't look like it would make good food. It has small kernels and hard cases, barely worth harvesting. How did ancient Mexicans recognize its potential and execute the complex breeding program necessary to transform it into maize? The standard explanation: trial and error over many centuries. But if knowledge about plant domestication was taught, if people with experience in agriculture shared techniques with populations still primarily hunting and gathering, the process would have been faster, more intentional. The association of Quetzalcoatl with maize, with the gift of agriculture, might preserve the memory of this teaching. In Polynesian tradition, the demigod Maui is credited with fishing up islands, capturing the sun, discovering fire, and teaching various skills. He's a trickster figure, clever and resourceful, and his stories are told across the Pacific with variations. Maui's exploits, particularly fishing up islands, might preserve memories of actual exploration and settlement. Polynesian navigators accomplished some of the most impressive feats of maritime exploration in human history, settling islands across the Pacific using sophisticated navigation techniques based on stars, waves, winds, and bird behavior. These navigation techniques were knowledge, teachable, transmissible. Where did they originate? The conventional answer is that they developed over time as Polynesians expanded through the Pacific. But what if some of the fundamental principles were inherited from older maritime traditions, taught by people who had been sailing for thousands of years before Polynesian expansion? The stories of Maui, of gods and heroes who teach navigation and exploration, might be the mythological encoding of that knowledge transfer. In Hindu tradition, the concept of the yugas, vast cycles of time in which the world goes through golden ages and dark ages, includes the idea that knowledge is lost and recovered cyclically. The Krita Yuga, Golden Age, is characterized by perfect knowledge, virtue, and long life. With each successive age, Trita, Dvapara, and finally Kali Yuga, the current age, knowledge diminishes, lifespans shorten, and humanity degrades. This cyclical view of history, with periodic destructions and rebuilding, appears in other traditions as well: the Hopi's multiple worlds, the Aztec suns, the Greek ages of gold, silver, bronze, and iron. What if these aren't just philosophical concepts but cultural memories of actual cycles? Of civilizations that rose, fell, and were partially rebuilt? Of knowledge that was lost and then slowly recovered? The environmental data supports the possibility of repeated disruptions. Climate in the Holocene has not been stable. The 8.2 kilo-year event, around 6200 BC, was a sudden cooling episode that lasted centuries, caused by the catastrophic drainage of glacial Lake Agassiz. The 4.2 kilo-year event, around 2200 BCE, was a severe drought that contributed to the collapse of multiple Bronze Age civilizations from Mesopotamia to Egypt to the Indus Valley. Each of these events would have disrupted emerging civilizations, causing population losses, migrations, collapses of complex societies. Knowledge would have been lost. Survivors would have had to rebuild with whatever fragments they preserved. The mythological concept of recurring ages, of knowledge lost and recovered, might be humanity's way of remembering this pattern, of recognizing that our trajectory isn't simply upward but cyclical, with progress and regress alternating. Now let's consider the physical evidence of potential contact and knowledge transfer in the form of shared technologies and design principles that appear in geographically separated cultures. Maritime technology is one obvious area. The construction of ocean-going vessels capable of long-distance travel requires sophisticated knowledge, understanding of hydrodynamics, materials engineering, navigation, sail design, and hull construction. Evidence of early maritime capability exists. The The settlement of Australia by 65,000 years ago required boats capable of crossing at least 90 kilometers of open ocean, demonstrating that humans were building watercraft far earlier than once thought. The settlement of islands in the Mediterranean and Southeast Asia during the Paleolithic similarly requires maritime technology. But the sophistication of boat building varies enormously. A raft or dugout canoe can cross relatively calm waters. An ocean-going vessel that can survive storms, carry cargo, and navigate without sight of land is a different order of complexity. The Polynesian outrigger canoes, capable of carrying dozens of people and supplies across thousands of kilometers of open ocean, represent the pinnacle of pre-industrial maritime engineering. The design principles, the double hull or outrigger configuration for stability, the crab claw or lateen sails, the understanding of how to provision and navigate for long voyages, are sophisticated. Similar design principles appear in other maritime cultures: the dhows of the Indian Ocean, the junks of China, the reed boats of the Andes and Egypt. Thor Heyerdahl famously demonstrated with the RA expeditions that ancient Egyptian-style reed boats could cross the Atlantic, suggesting the possibility of pre-Columbian contact between the Old World and the New. While his conclusions remain controversial, the experiments proved that the technology was sufficient for long-distance ocean travel, even if we can't confirm it was actually used that way. If a maritime civilization existed before the Younger Dryas, boat-building knowledge would have been one of their core technologies, essential for communication between coastal settlements. When their world drowned, that knowledge would have been carried inland by refugees, where some populations, particularly those settling new coastal areas, would adopt it, while others, those remaining inland, would have no use for it and would let it lapse. The result? Pockets of sophisticated maritime knowledge appearing around the world, sometimes in cultures that don't seem to have had time to develop such sophistication locally, and often with surprisingly similar design principles despite geographic separation. Another technology to consider: textile production and weaving. The basics of weaving appear in the archaeological record fairly early, with fragments of woven materials dating back at least 27,000 years. But sophisticated textile production, the creation of complex patterns, the use of multiple colors, the development of looms that can produce large cloth pieces, requires mathematical understanding and engineering skill. The invention of the loom is a significant technological achievement, requiring the understanding of tensioning, of how to maintain even spacing, of how to manipulate warp and weft threads to create patterns. And yet, wherever we find early civilizations, we find sophisticated textiles. The Mesopotamians produced complex patterned fabrics. The Egyptians made fine linen. The Indus Valley Civilization created dyed textiles with standardized measurements. The Peruvians produced some of the most sophisticated textiles in the ancient world, with complex patterns, multiple colors, and techniques like tapestry weaving that rival anything from the Old World. How did these separated cultures all develop similar textile technologies? Convergent evolution is possible. Weaving is a logical solution to the problem of making cloth. But the similarities in loom design, in certain patterns and techniques, are striking. If textile knowledge was among the technologies shared by a precursor civilization, it would make sense that it would spread widely. Textiles are essential in most climates, immediately useful, and the technology is teachable. A population learning to weave would quickly adopt and adapt the techniques, integrating them into their own cultural context. Metallurgy presents a different pattern. The smelting of copper, bronze, and iron appears at different times in different regions, but the underlying principles are the same: the application of high heat to specific ores in controlled conditions to extract metal. This is not obvious knowledge. The ores don't look like metal. The process requires temperatures beyond what normal fires produce, necessitating the development of furnaces, bellows, and understanding of chemical reactions that aren't visible or intuitive. Yet metallurgy appears in Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, China, Southeast Asia, Mesoamerica, and South America, often with surprisingly similar techniques despite apparent independence. The Bronze Age, characterized by the alloying of copper with tin to create a harder, more useful metal, appears in multiple Old World civilizations within a relatively narrow time frame, roughly 3300 to 1200 BC in the Near East, somewhat later elsewhere. The knowledge that adding tin to copper produces a superior material is highly specific. How did multiple cultures discover this independently? If metallurgical knowledge was taught, if the basic principles of ore identification, furnace construction, and metalworking were shared by knowledgeable teachers, it would accelerate discovery. Local populations would still need to adapt the techniques to their available materials, which explains the variations, but the fundamental principles would spread as teachable knowledge rather than as independent invention. Now consider mathematical and measurement systems. The Sumerian base 60 system we discussed earlier is elegant and practical, but it's not the only option. The Mayans used a base 20 system, vigesimal, which is also mathematically sophisticated and allows complex calculations. The Egyptians used base 10, like modern mathematics, but also understood fractions in a unique way, representing them as sums of unit fractions. The Babylonians, inheriting Sumerian knowledge, understood the Pythagorean theorem centuries before Pythagoras, applied it in construction and surveying, and developed sophisticated algebraic techniques. These different mathematical traditions all work. They're all effective for their purposes. But they all require the same fundamental insight, that quantities can be abstracted, represented symbolically, manipulated according to rules to produce predictable results. That insight, the foundation of mathematical thinking, isn't necessarily obvious. Many traditional societies function perfectly well with limited counting systems, not extending beyond 1, 2, many. The leap to abstract mathematics, to algebra and geometry, requires a particular kind of cognitive framework. If that framework, that way of thinking about quantity and relationship, was taught as part of the knowledge transfer from a precursor civilization, it would explain why sophisticated mathematics appears relatively early in multiple cultures. The specific systems, base 60, base 20, base 10, would vary based on local preferences and needs, but the underlying mathematical thinking would share a common origin. Let's examine specific archaeological sites that present anomalies or challenges to the conventional timeline, considering how they fit into the hypothesis of knowledge transfer from a precursor civilization. Stonehenge, in England, is one of the most studied prehistoric monuments in the world. Its construction spanned from about 3000 BCE to 1600 BCE, with different phases using different materials and reflecting evolving purposes. The most famous phase, the erection of the Sarsen stone circle and trilithons, dates to around 2500 BC. The Sarsen stones, weight up to 25 tons each, were transported from Marlborough Downs, about 25 kilometers away. The blue stones, weighing up to 4 tons, were transported from the Preseli Hills in Wales, over 250 kilometers away. Why would Neolithic people transport stones such vast distances? The conventional answer, the stones had ritual significance, possibly related to healing properties attributed to the blue stones, possibly related to astronomical alignments encoded in the monument structure. Stonehenge aligns with the midsummer sunrise and midwinter sunset, suggesting it functioned as a calendar, marking the solstices. The precision of this alignment implies sophisticated astronomical knowledge. But here's the anomaly: Stonehenge is not the first henge monument in Britain. It's part of a tradition of circular earthwork and stone monuments that stretches back thousands of years. But it's by far the most sophisticated, representing a sudden leap in engineering capability and astronomical precision. What prompted that leap? What knowledge became available around 2500 BCE that allowed the builders of Stonehenge to accomplish something their ancestors hadn't? If we apply the knowledge transfer hypothesis, one possibility is that around this time, ideas and techniques were spreading across Europe from elsewhere, possibly from the Mediterranean region where similar megalithic traditions existed, possibly from even older sources that were influencing multiple regions. The beaker culture, which spread across Europe around 2500 BCE, is associated with metallurgy, new pottery styles, and possibly new religious practices. Some researchers have suggested the beaker people facilitated cultural exchange, carrying ideas and technologies across wide areas. If the beaker expansion included the transmission of astronomical and architectural knowledge from older sources, It would explain the sudden sophistication of Stonehenge's final phases. Newgrange, in Ireland, predates Stonehenge by centuries. Built around 3200 BCE, it's a passage tomb constructed so that the rising sun on the winter solstice illuminates the inner chamber through a precisely positioned roof box. The alignment is accurate to within a few minutes of arc, demonstrating that the builders understood the sun's motion, could predict the solstice, and possessed surveying skills to orient the structure correctly. Newgrange is older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge's major phases, contemporary with the earliest phases of Mesopotamian urbanism. Yet it displays architectural sophistication that we don't usually associate with Neolithic Europe. Corbelled roofing that has remained watertight for 5,000 years, decorated curbstones with complex spiral patterns, astronomical alignment requiring precise planning. How did Neolithic Irish people acquire this knowledge? The conventional answer: through long observation of the sky, through trial and error in construction techniques, through gradual cultural development. But the spiral motifs on Newgrange's stones are strikingly similar to spiral motifs found in Neolithic sites across Europe, in Malta, in Iberia, in the Mediterranean. The design isn't unique to Ireland. It's part of a wider symbolic language that was shared across a vast area. If that symbolic language and the associated astronomical knowledge were being transmitted through networks of contact, possibly influenced by older traditions moving up from the Mediterranean or from Atlantic coastal populations, it would explain both the sophistication and the shared motifs. The megalithic temples of Malta, dating from 3600 to 2500 BCE, are among the oldest freestanding structures in the world. They're built from massive limestone blocks, some weighing over 20 tons, fitted together with corbelling and precision. The temples feature complex multi-room layouts, decorated with spiral carvings and astronomical alignments. Malta is a small island. Where did its Neolithic population acquire the knowledge to build such structures? There's no evidence of a long developmental sequence on the island. The temples appear relatively suddenly in the archaeological record, already sophisticated. The island's location in the central Mediterranean placed it at a crossroads of maritime trade routes. If knowledge was being transmitted by seafaring peoples, Malta would have been an ideal location for contact, for the exchange of ideas, for the teaching of architectural and astronomical principles. The abrupt end of the temple-building culture around 2500 BCE, possibly due to environmental stress or invasion, suggests how fragile knowledge transmission can be. The temples remained, but the knowledge of how to build them was lost, not recovered by later populations on the island. Moving to South America, Tiwanaku and Pumapunku in Bolivia. The Tiwanaku culture flourished from approximately 500 CE to 1000 CE, but the site itself shows evidence of much earlier occupation. Some researchers, analyzing the architecture and astronomical alignments, have argued that portions of the site were constructed during different climate periods, possibly much earlier than the Tiwanaku culture's historical phase. Pumapunku, in particular, displays stonework that seems incongruous with the supposed technological capabilities of the Tiwanaku people. Andesite blocks, one of the hardest stones, are cut with perfectly smooth surfaces, right angles precise to fractions of a degree, and complex interlocking shapes that suggest modular construction. The blocks feature H-shaped grooves, as if they were designed to be joined with metal clamps, though no evidence of such clamps has been found. The precision suggests the use of advanced tools and measurement techniques. The conventional explanation: the Tiwanaku possessed bronze tools and considerable skill. The precision was achieved through patient grinding and polishing using sand and water, not through advanced machinery. That's certainly possible. But the degree of precision, particularly in some of the more complex blocks, pushes the boundaries of what we'd expect from the available technology. If Pumapunku incorporates knowledge from older sources, if the Tiwanaku were themselves rebuilding or modifying structures that were already ancient, using techniques taught by predecessors, the sophistication becomes more understandable. There's also the puzzle of Tiwanaku's location at 3,800 meters above sea level near Lake Titicaca. Why build a major ceremonial center at such altitude, where agriculture is difficult and the climate is harsh? One proposal: Tiwanaku's location reflects a time when the region's climate was different, wetter and more temperate, making agriculture more viable at high altitude. That would push some of the site's origins back to a much earlier period, possibly pre-Younger Dryas or early Holocene when Andean climate patterns were different. The Nazca lines present their own set of mysteries. These geoglyphs, etched into the Peruvian desert, date from approximately 500 BCE to 500 CE. They include geometric shapes, straight lines, spirals, triangles, and animal figures. A monkey, a spider, a condor, a hummingbird, a whale. Many of the figures are enormous, only recognizable from the air at altitudes of several hundred meters. Why would a pre-Columbian culture create art meant to be viewed from a vantage point they couldn't reach? Various theories have been proposed. The lines are ceremonial pathways, meant to be walked in ritual procession, not viewed from above. They relate to water cult practices with the lines pointing toward underground water. Sources or mountain peaks associated with rain. They function as an astronomical calendar, with certain lines aligning to the rising and setting positions of important stars. They served as a form of prayer or communication with sky gods, meant to be viewed by deities even if not by humans. All of these explanations have merit and supporting evidence. The lines clearly had ritual significance for the Nazca culture. They're associated with pottery offerings, and the effort required to create them speaks to their importance. But there's another possibility to consider, that the Nazca were reproducing designs or following principles taught by predecessors who actually could view the lines from above, not through flight, but through knowledge of how to design images meant to be viewed from altitude. If you possess surveying knowledge, understanding of perspective, and mathematical ability, you can design a figure that will be recognizable from above even while standing on the ground. You set out a grid system, use sighting lines and markers, plan the proportions mathematically, and create the image working from a carefully prepared plan. This requires sophisticated knowledge, but it's achievable without flight. The question is, where did the Nazca acquire this knowledge, and why did they choose to apply it in this particular way? If the knowledge was inherited from older traditions, if creating images for gods in the sky was part of a religious practice taught by predecessors who emphasized astronomical observation and the importance of viewing the Earth from a cosmic perspective, then the Nazca might have been continuing a tradition whose original purpose they no longer fully understood but still honored. The figures would then be a form of cultural memory, a practice maintained because it was taught as sacred, even if the original reason for viewing designs from above had been forgotten. Moving back to the Old World, Göbekli Tepe remains one of the most challenging sites for conventional archaeology. The site's 9600 BC date places it in the pre-pottery Neolithic A period, when humans in the region were supposedly still mobile hunter-gatherers, or at most in the very early stages of experimenting with plant cultivation and sedentism. Yet Göbekli Tepe required quarrying and transporting 10 to 20-ton limestone pillars, carving complex reliefs into the pillars, depicting animals, abstract symbols, and anthropomorphic figures, erecting the pillars vertically and arranging them in circular patterns, coordinating labor from multiple groups to accomplish construction, maintaining the site over centuries, with evidence of multiple building phases and eventual deliberate burial of earlier structures. None of this fits the profile of mobile hunter-gatherers barely scraping by. The conventional explanation has evolved to accommodate the site. Perhaps the abundance of wild resources in the region allowed for seasonal gatherings of groups who collectively worked on the site during periods of plenty. Perhaps the construction of the site actually drove the development of agriculture, as the need to support labor gangs at Göbekli Tepe forced experimentation with food production. That's an interesting inversion of the usual model, religion and monument construction driving economic change rather than vice versa. It's possible, but it still doesn't fully explain the sophistication, the sudden appearance of complex symbolic art, the evident planning and astronomical knowledge embedded in the site's layout. If we apply the knowledge transfer hypothesis, what if the people who built Göbekli Tepe had been taught by survivors of the Younger Dryas, people who brought knowledge from the pre-Younger Dryas period, who were helping local populations organize, build, and establish practices that would lead to agriculture and settled life? Göbekli Tepe would then be a teaching monument, a place where knowledge was transmitted through construction, where the act of building taught organizational skills, where the carvings encoded symbolic knowledge about the relationship between humans, animals, and cosmos. The site's eventual burial around 8000 BCE might mark the end of this teaching phase, the point at which the knowledge had been successfully transmitted and the site had served its purpose. Rather than abandoning it to decay, the builders carefully buried it, preserving it but ending its active use. This interpretation is speculative, but it fits the evidence as well as conventional explanations, and it accounts for the site's anomalous sophistication. There's a broader pattern here worth noting. Many of the most anomalous, sophisticated ancient sites show evidence of being deliberately buried, decommissioned, or abandoned at their peak rather than declining gradually. Göbekli Tepe was buried. The megaliths of Malta ceased to be built suddenly. The Nazca lines, having been created over centuries, were suddenly abandoned. Teotihuacan in Mexico was mysteriously abandoned at the height of its power around 550 CE, with evidence of ritual burning of major structures. Why would cultures abandon or bury their most sacred sites while they were still fully functional? One possibility: the sites had fulfilled their purpose. If they were teaching monuments, once the knowledge was transmitted, they were no longer needed. Burying them or walking away wasn't abandonment, it was completion. This would suggest a different way of thinking about monuments than our modern mindset assumes. We build to last, to leave permanent marks on the landscape, to be remembered. But perhaps some ancient structures were built with an understanding that knowledge, not stone, is what truly lasts. The stones were tools for teaching, and once the lesson was learned, the tool could be set aside. Let's return to the myths and see if we can extract more specific information that might point to the nature and location of the hypothetical precursor civilization. Many flood myths contain specific geographic details that are often dismissed as mythological flourishes but might preserve actual information. Plato's account of Atlantis, recorded in the dialogues Timaeus and Critias, circa 360 BCE, describes a sophisticated island civilization located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar, in the Atlantic Ocean. Atlantis supposedly existed 9,000 years before Solon's time, circa 600 BCE, placing it around 9,600 BC, exactly the end of the Younger Dryas. The account describes Atlantis as a maritime power, technologically advanced, with a system of circular canals, monumental architecture, and a hierarchical society. It supposedly conquered much of the Mediterranean before being defeated by ancient Athens, then sank into the sea in a single day and night due to earthquakes and floods. Most scholars consider Atlantis a philosophical invention by Plato, a rhetorical device for exploring ideas about ideal societies and their corruption. The timing, the dramatic destruction, the lack of any other historical reference to such a civilization, all suggest fiction rather than history. But what if Plato was working from a real tradition, preserved in Egyptian sources? He claims the story came from Egyptian priests, and elaborated it for his philosophical purposes. The date he provides, 9600 BC, corresponds to the end of the Younger Dryas and the beginning of rapid sea level rise. The description of a maritime civilization destroyed by flooding and earthquakes could preserve a garbled memory of real events. The location beyond the Pillars of Hercules might be incorrect or misremembered. If the actual civilization existed on the now submerged continental shelves in various locations, and the story was transmitted through multiple cultures over thousands of years, geographic details could easily become confused. The circular canal system, the sophisticated architecture, the maritime power, these could be real details, attached to a mythologized narrative, placed in the wrong location, but preserving a core of historical truth. I'm not arguing Atlantis was real in the way Plato describes it. I'm suggesting the possibility that his account, however embellished, might draw on genuine cultural memories of a pre-Younger Dryas civilization that was destroyed by the climate catastrophes and rising seas of the early Holocene. Similar geographic hints appear in other traditions. The Sumerian myths reference Dilmun, a paradise land associated with the rising sun, a place of purity and eternal life, where illness and death didn't exist. Dilmun is usually identified with Bahrain or the eastern Arabian coast. But older versions of the myths suggest Dilmun was more distant, harder to reach, possibly submerged or lost. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes Dilmun as the home of Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, located at the mouth of the rivers, possibly referring to the Persian Gulf, which was much smaller during the Ice Age, with vast coastal plains now underwater. If Dilmun represents a memory of prosperous settlements on the now submerged Persian Gulf floor, the mythological paradise becomes a historical reference. A place that was indeed more fertile, more comfortable, now lost beneath the waves, remembered as a golden age. Hindu and Buddhist traditions speak of Kumari Kandam or Lemuria, a lost continent supposedly existing south of India, which sank beneath the Indian Ocean. While most scholars consider this a modern myth or misinterpretation of older texts, Tamil literature contains references to sangams, literary academies, in ancient cities that were lost to the sea. Could this preserve a memory of settlements on the Sunda Shelf, the now submerged landmass connecting India, Southeast Asia, and Indonesia? During the Ice Age, this area, called Sundaland, would have been dry land, potentially a prime location for human settlement with its tropical climate and abundant resources. When sea levels rose, Sundaland flooded, creating the islands of Indonesia, separating Sri Lanka from India, transforming the landscape completely. Any civilizations that existed there would have been drowned, their populations forced to migrate to higher ground. Exactly the diaspora pattern we've been discussing. Aboriginal Australian oral traditions contain detailed accounts of land that is now underwater, coastlines that have since flooded, specific geographic features now submerged. Some of these stories, when analyzed by geologists, correspond accurately to sea level changes that occurred 7,000 to 12,000 years ago. Patrick Nunn and Nicholas Reed have studied these traditions, finding that Aboriginal stories from various parts of Australia describe the flooding of areas that we know, from geological evidence, were above water during the Ice Age and flooded as sea levels rose. This demonstrates that oral tradition can preserve accurate information across astonishing time depths, 10,000 years of memory, passed voice to voice, generation to generation. If Aboriginal Australians preserved accurate geographic memories for 10,000 years, why shouldn't we take seriously the possibility that other cultures also preserved memories of pre-Holocene geography, events, and peoples in their myths? The Chinese tradition includes references to a great flood during the reign of Emperor Yao, around 2300 BC in traditional chronology. The flood was eventually controlled by Yu the Great, who dredged rivers and created channels to manage the water, founding the Xia dynasty. While this is much later than the end of the Younger Dryas, it might preserve memories of one of the later climate disruptions, possibly the 4.2 kilo-year event around 2200 BC, blended with older flood traditions from deeper time. The interesting detail is Yu's role. He's a culture hero who brings order from chaos, who teaches water management, who establishes civilization. The pattern recurs: a catastrophe, followed by a teacher figure who brings knowledge, who helps survivors rebuild. Native American traditions across both continents contain emergence myths, describing how people came into the current world from a previous world that was destroyed. The Hopi describe multiple previous worlds, each destroyed by different catastrophes. The Navajo describe emerging from lower worlds through a reed, arriving in this world after floods and disasters. The Iroquois tradition speaks of Sky Woman, who fell from the sky world to land on Turtle's back, creating the earth. Her descendants became the first humans in this world. These aren't literal histories in the way we understand the term. They're mythologized, symbolic, expressing cosmological and spiritual truths. But they consistently describe a transition from a previous world or age into the current one, with catastrophe and transformation as the mechanism. If we interpret previous world as previous climate age, the myths map onto geological reality. The world before the Younger Dryas was different. Different coastlines, different climate, different distribution of human populations. The Younger Dryas and its end was a catastrophic transformation. The world after was new, changed, requiring adaptation and rebuilding. The myths preserve this pattern, even if the specific details are mythologized beyond literal interpretation. Now let's address the most challenging question. If this precursor civilization existed, if they possessed sophisticated knowledge, why didn't they have writing? Why didn't they leave unambiguous texts that would prove their existence? Writing is a relatively late invention in the archaeological record. The earliest undisputed writing systems date to around 3200 BC, Sumerian cuneiform in Mesopotamia and Egyptian hieroglyphs. Proto-writing systems, symbolic marks that might represent early attempts at writing, appear somewhat earlier, but true writing, capable of representing full language, dates to the Bronze Age. That's 6,000 years later than Göbekli Tepe. 8,000 years after the end of the Younger Dryas. If sophisticated civilization existed before the Younger Dryas, why didn't they write? Several possible answers. First, they might have, but if they wrote on perishable materials, bark, leather, wood, papyrus-like fibers, nothing would survive 12,000 years except in the most extraordinary preservation conditions. The Dead Sea Scrolls, preserved in the dry desert environment, date to only 2,000 years ago. The oldest surviving papyrus fragments from Egypt are about 4,500 years old, from a time when Egyptian culture was already literate for centuries. If the precursor civilization used perishable writing materials and their settlements are now underwater, drowned 11,000 years ago, we would never find their texts. They're gone, dissolved, decayed, leaving no trace. Second, they might not have developed phonetic writing. The leap from symbolic representation to phonetic writing, where symbols represent sounds that can encode any word in a language, is conceptually difficult. Many sophisticated cultures managed complex economies and societies using accounting systems, pictographic symbols, and memory aids without developing full phonetic writing. The Inca Empire, one of the largest empires in the world, never developed writing. They used quipu, knotted cords, to record information, a system sophisticated enough to manage a complex bureaucracy across thousands of miles. If the precursor civilization used a similar non-phonetic system, it might not be recognizable as writing to us, especially if it was on perishable materials. Third, knowledge transmission through oral tradition and practical demonstration might have been their preferred method. If your culture highly values personal teaching relationships, apprenticeship, and oral memory, you might not feel the need for writing. Aboriginal Australian cultures maintained extraordinarily complex knowledge systems for tens of thousands of years without writing, using songlines, stories, and ritual to encode information about geography, resources, law, and cosmology. The ancient Druids of Celtic Europe, by all accounts, possessed extensive knowledge but deliberately avoided writing it down, considering oral transmission more reliable and sacred. If the precursor civilization had strong oral traditions and used monuments, symbols, and ritual as memory aids rather than written texts, they could have been sophisticated without being literate in the way we understand literacy. Fourth, and more speculatively, what if they did develop writing and we found it but don't recognize it? Some petroglyphs, carved symbols on rocks worldwide, are assumed to be decorative or shamanic rather than writing. But what if some of them are writing? A symbolic system we haven't decoded because we don't know what language it represents and we lack context to understand its rules. The Indus Valley script, used from approximately 3500 to 1900 BCE, remains undeciphered. We have thousands of examples, but the texts are short, the language unknown, and despite decades of effort, no one has convincingly cracked the code. If we can't read the Indus script from 4,000 years ago, what hope do we have of recognizing and deciphering a script from 12,000 years ago, especially if we only have fragmentary examples? The absence of readable texts from a precursor civilization doesn't prove they didn't exist. It might just mean their texts are lost, unrecognized, or undeciphered. But let's entertain the most conservative position, that this precursor civilization did not have writing as we understand it. Does that disqualify them from being civilization? Our definition of civilization tends to include writing as a key criterion, along with urbanism, specialization, monumental architecture, and complex social organization. But that definition is culturally biased. It reflects the characteristics of the civilizations we know best: Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Greek, Roman, Chinese, all of which were literate. Yet the Inca built an empire without writing. The Norte Chico civilization of Peru, dating from 3000 to 1800 BCE, built monumental pyramids, managed complex irrigation systems, and engaged in trade, but left no evidence of writing. If we insist that writing is essential to civilization, we exclude cultures that were clearly complex, organized, and sophisticated by any other measure. So let's use a broader definition: civilization as a culture that has transcended immediate subsistence concerns, developed specialization, created lasting structures, accumulated and transmitted knowledge across generations, and organized labor for collective projects. By that definition, a pre-Younger Dryas culture that built boats, navigated by stars, constructed fish weirs and aquaculture systems, developed sophisticated tool-making techniques, and created art and ritual practices would qualify as civilized, even without writing. They would be the civilization we're looking for, sophisticated enough to teach, to share knowledge, to influence the scattered populations they encountered after their world drowned. And they would leave exactly the kind of trace we see: myths, shared technologies, sudden appearances of knowledge, monuments that encode astronomical understanding, genetic admixture, and an archaeological record that hints at sophistication appearing too early. So where should we look for more definitive evidence? The answer: underwater. Specifically on the continental shelves in regions that would have been prime habitation zones 15,000 to 12,000 years ago. Priority areas would include Sundaland, the massive shelf between Southeast Asia and Australia, now submerged. This would have been a vast, resource-rich area with tropical climate, ideal for human settlement. It's connected to the myths of lost lands in Hindu and Southeast Asian traditions. The Persian Gulf, almost entirely dry land during the Ice Age, with major rivers running through it. The Tigris, Euphrates, and other rivers would have created a fertile valley where the Gulf now lies. Any settlements there would be under meters of sediment and water. This connects to the Sumerian Dilmun myths. The Black Sea. Evidence suggests the Black Sea flooded catastrophically around 5600 BCE when the Mediterranean breached the Bosporus, turning a freshwater lake into a saltwater sea. While this is later than the Younger Dryas, it might have flooded areas with existing settlements. The flooding of the Black Sea has been proposed as a source for flood myths in the region. The North Sea and Doggerland, the plain connecting Britain to Europe, rich in resources, inhabited by Mesolithic peoples. Doggerland flooded gradually as sea levels rose, with some evidence of settlements in what is now the North Sea floor. The Grand Banks off Newfoundland, parts of this area were above water during the Ice Age. Some researchers have speculated about pre-Clovis settlements in this region. The Bahama Banks, extensive shallow water that was dry land during the Ice Age, potentially habitable. The Bimini Road and other underwater anomalies in the area are controversial but suggestive. Systematic survey of these areas, using advanced sonar, submersibles, and core sampling, might reveal evidence of human habitation, structures, tools, or other artifacts that would shift our understanding of when and where sophisticated cultures developed. Such research is expensive and time-consuming, but it's feasible with current technology. What's lacking is institutional will and funding, largely because the orthodox timeline doesn't predict finding anything significant, so there's no perceived reason to look. But paradigms can shift. Göbekli Tepe shifted paradigms. The discovery of the Denisovans shifted paradigms. If underwater archaeology begins to reveal evidence of pre-Holocene coastal settlements, another shift will follow. So here we are, at the end of this long journey through time and mystery. What have we discovered? What can we conclude? We've examined flood myths that appear in every major culture, describing catastrophic deluges and survivor figures who teach the remnants of humanity how to rebuild. We've looked at the sudden appearance of agriculture, complex societies, and sophisticated knowledge in the early Holocene, immediately following the environmental chaos of the Younger Dryas. We've explored megalithic monuments that demonstrate astronomical knowledge and construction capabilities appearing without evident precedent, built by cultures that supposedly lacked the organizational capacity for such projects. We've considered genetic evidence of ghost populations, unexpected admixture events, and the complexity of human migration and interaction in deep time. We've traced symbols, technologies, and mathematical concepts that appear in widely separated Cultures, suggesting contact or common heritage rather than independent invention. We've mapped the submerged coastlines, the drowned land masses, the 27 million square kilometers of land now underwater that we've barely explored. And we've assembled a hypothesis that a maritime civilization developed on these coastal plains before the Younger Dryas, maintained some continuity through that climatic catastrophe, and then, as their world drowned in the early Holocene, dispersed inland, making contact with scattered post-glacial populations and sharing knowledge that accelerated the emergence of civilization worldwide. This hypothesis is not proven. It may never be proven without direct archaeological evidence from underwater sites. But it's consistent with the available data, and it explains patterns that are difficult to account for through conventional models of independent invention and linear cultural development. More importantly, this hypothesis restores a sense of depth to human history. It suggests we are not children, fumbling our way toward civilization in just a few thousand years. We are inheritors of a much longer story, carrying forward knowledge that was hard-won over tens of thousands of years, partially lost, gradually recovered. Our myths are not mere fantasies. They're memory, distorted by time but preserving truth at their cores. Our monuments are not just religious structures. They're teachers encoding knowledge in stone, waiting for us to rediscover what our ancestors knew. Our technologies are not entirely our inventions. They're often rediscoveries, the latest iteration of solutions that humans worked out long ago, lost, and found again. This view of human history is humbling. It reminds us that we can lose everything: knowledge, civilization, continuity. The people who built Göbekli Tepe, who mapped the stars from Newgrange, who navigated by them across the Pacific, who raised the Moai on Easter Island, they had knowledge we've lost, techniques we can't replicate, understandings we're still trying to reconstruct. But it's also empowering, because it means we carry within our collective memory, encoded in myth and ritual and tradition, the wisdom of countless generations. When we look at ancient monuments, we're not looking at primitive people's crude attempts at meaning. We're looking at the work of our sophisticated ancestors, people who understood deep time, cosmic cycles, the fragility of civilization. They built those monuments for us, to teach us, to warn us, to remind us that we've been here before, that we've survived catastrophes before, that knowledge can persist even when everything else is lost. If this hypothesis is correct, if there was a civilization before our civilizations, teachers before our teachers, knowledge that survived through catastrophe and was shared across the world, then the greatest mystery isn't where they came from or how they disappeared. The greatest mystery is what they knew that we've forgotten. What understanding of the cosmos, of consciousness, of humanity's place in the universe they possessed that we're still struggling to recover. The monuments remain. The myths persist. The evidence, fragmented and contested, continues to accumulate. And we're left with questions that have no final answers, only deeper inquiry. Were the Sumerians remembering something real when they spoke of knowledge lowered from heaven after the flood? Was Plato preserving a genuine tradition when he wrote of Atlantis, or creating a useful fiction that accidentally echoes older truths? Do the Aboriginal Australians, maintaining oral traditions spanning 10,000 years, preserve the most accurate memory of the transition from the Ice Age to our modern world? What lies beneath the Persian Gulf, beneath the North Sea, beneath the continental shelves around every continent, waiting to be discovered, to overturn our assumptions, to reveal how much deeper our story runs than we knew? These questions don't have answers tonight. Perhaps they'll never have complete answers. The past is vast, mostly lost, recoverable only in fragments. But the search itself matters. The willingness to question, to look at anomalies and ask, what if? To take myths seriously as potential history, to challenge paradigms that may be incomplete. This is how understanding grows. You've listened to this journey all the way through. That says something about you, about your willingness to sit with uncertainty, to entertain possibilities that aren't proven, to wonder about the gaps in our knowledge. Hold that quality. Nurture it. Because the questions we ask shape the answers we find, and the mysteries we're willing to acknowledge determine how much we can discover. The teachers, if they existed, are long gone. Their cities are drowned, their names forgotten, their texts, if they had them, dissolved by time. But their legacy persists. In the knowledge we use without knowing its origins. In the monuments that still stand, silent and enigmatic. In the myths we tell, carrying forward echoes of experiences so profound they couldn't be forgotten even across 100 centuries. We are the descendants of survivors. Of people who weathered unimaginable catastrophes, who rebuilt from fragments, who refused to let everything be lost. And perhaps, in our own time, as we face our own challenges, climate change, potential civilizational disruption, the fragility of our interconnected systems, we can learn from those ancient survivors. That knowledge is worth preserving, worth encoding in durable forms, worth teaching to those who come after. That civilizations rise and fall, but human resilience persists. That the story is always longer, deeper, more complex than we imagine. Look around you now. The world you inhabit is built on 10,000 years of visible history and perhaps 10,000 more of hidden history. Every tool you use, every building you enter, every word you speak carries forward innovations and insights from ancestors whose names we'll never know. You are the latest chapter in a story that stretches back into the mists of deep time, carried forward by people who refused to let the light go out, who taught their children, who built monuments to preserve what mattered most. What will you carry forward? What knowledge will you preserve? What will you build that might last, that might teach, that might help those who come after if everything else is lost? These aren't abstract questions. They're the same questions our ancestors faced when their world drowned, when the ice came, when everything had to be rebuilt from memory and hope. We are them. They are us. The circle continues. If this resonated with you, if you found yourself thinking differently about human history, about the depth of our story, leave a like. Share this with someone who wonders, who questions, who feels that tug toward mysteries that sleep between accepted history and forgotten truth. And tell me, what do you think happened? What do you believe lies beneath those continental shelves? What myths from your own culture might preserve memories of the deep past? The conversation continues. The search goes on. The mysteries remain, waiting for us to develop the tools, the questions, the willingness to look deeply enough to find them. Sleep well wherever you are. And dream of deep time, of ancestors who knew more than we credit, of knowledge waiting to be rediscovered. The teachers are gone. But what they taught persists, encoded in stone and myth and memory, waiting for us to remember.